everybody. This is Stefani Rupert. Thank you for tuning in to the Naked Humanity, Once the Meaning of Everything podcast. Today is episode number 32X, and in it, I'm going to elaborate on some themes we discussed in the last podcast, talk about loneliness and the unique individualism of the modern world. So if you haven't listened to my most recent conversation yet, go do that first if you want. It's a fantastic conversation. I highly recommend it if you're at all interested, or if you have ever once experienced loneliness, definitely worth a listen. And there were a couple of things that we talked about throughout that podcast that I think are definitely worth revisiting. And especially, I want to sort of lay it out in a more historical context to tell you more about the history of how we ended up being in a uniquely, what we are seeing now is a somewhat a uniquely lonely world. You know, why are we in such a uniquely lonely world? So that is the topic for today. I have a winner, of course, for the book drawing. Her name is Kelly Rigetti. Really exciting stuff. She wanted love poems from God, which is a common request. It's a fantastic book, a collection of poetry from mystic poets, starting with Rumi and some other Sufi classics like Hafiz, and some Christian mystics as well, such as Meister Eckhart in the Middle Ages, and just a really brilliant book. So I'm very, very excited to be able to share that with her and with any of you who want to enter into the drawing. There's a good chance you can win a book if you enter the drawing. Let me put it that way. I'll just put it that way. There's a good chance you can get a book. So that's very exciting. That's all I have. Again, we recently changed our name. Thank you for your patience. And now we're Naked Humanity. And isn't that exciting? It's very, very exciting. Moving into today's content, episode number 32X, the uniquely lonely world that we live in. You know, there's so much that goes into making our world today the way that it is. So first, I think the important thing to do is to bring up an example for contrast. What might our ancestors' lives have looked like? It's probably the case that they were very rarely lonely. Our ancient ancestors, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, before the advent of agriculture, you know, so they roved in tribes and bands. They were hunter-gatherers. They lived in tribes, and these tribes were, as our last guest, Ellie Pierce, mentioned, these tribes were much larger than the tribes of our greater ancestors, the primates, the great apes. Their tribes were much bigger than this, but still vastly smaller than they are today. You know, they numbered in the hundreds, 150, 300, maybe 1,000 or so. But they weren't anything like the scale we see today. Within these groups, however, it's pretty easy to know who 1,000 people are, 1,500 people say, especially if you live in that group your whole life. And so you were always held in a space of community, and you might long for a particular friendship or want to jump up the hierarchy or think another dude or another lady is going to be a better partner for you. And those things felt like loneliness, but they were more like what, again, Dr. Ellie Pierce described as transient loneliness. You know, they were very short-lived. They weren't endemic states that people existed in for decades at a time, or that people ended their lives in now today in the modern world. Back then, it was much more assured that you would be in a big group of people, and you would have smaller groups within that group, but you were still definitely a part of this community, and you had this sense of belonging. And I also discussed how there was a shared narrative, right? You had the same purposes to survive, and you talked about it in terms of the same stories. You know, you had the same creation myth, the same origin story, and you accounted for the world in the same way. And when tragic events happened, you explained them in the same way. And This is really important. You had the same ideas about what was good and what was evil. And that sort of thing is actually really powerful in making you feel united with somebody, which is why in today's world, we're so often drawn to people who share ideas with us. There is something very comforting and safe in being around people who have a shared narrative. Now, unfortunately, in today's world, we are around a huge plurality of narratives, which it has its positives as well, downsides and negative and upsides. But this is totally new. The world used to be just a shared narrative, and it had firm social bonds. Now, with the advent of agriculture, this began to change shape. All of the sudden, private property ownership became important. It wasn't really previously. Nobody had land, nobody had claims to land, but all of a sudden, it became a really big question of who owns this land, who's growing these corn stalks, who's growing this wheat, became a very important question for power and for the regulation of society. And there are many people who theorize that this is when actually people became much more concerned about paternity, because previously it might not have been such a big deal. And sexuality might have been much more fluid between partners. But once you have property, you want to keep it and you want to hand it down. And so it becomes a really big question of whose son is who. And then all of a sudden, nuclear families begin to become much more prominent in the conceptualization of connected space, how you relate to one another. And these families continue to exist within tribes, and they still have shared stories and gods and what have you. But nuclear families became much more important. Now, that can be really isolating, actually. It might not have happened right away. Families still existed within tribes, and then in ancient Greece and Rome, in city-states, and these became more anonymous, but they were still a singular community with a unified community, with a set of goals. Definitely, they were these ancient Greek city-states like Sparta. They were Athens. They were so oriented on the preservation of their city, of their polis, what it was called. So that endures for quite a while, but eventually, as cities began to grow, as people move out of the countryside, and this is hundreds of years later in the Middle Ages, and moving out of the Middle Ages and the modernizing period, the Industrial Revolution, begin to see the anonymization of our interactions with people, right? Because these urban centers grow, and all of a sudden the world is way too big to have a community, a firm community. You might have your own particular religious community, which became a thing in the modernizing period as religions began to diversify and multiply. But there was more anonymity, and there was more opportunity to be sequestered away into your family. And this was definitely a problem for women increasingly, right? Because you could become a part of your house, your role was domestic, and men might go out into the world and do stuff. But this was increasing throughout, the few hundred years leading up to now. In the 1920s, cities really began exploding. And nowadays we live in these massive metropolitan centers, and we live in worlds that are incredibly diverse. And so we don't share narratives, we don't share beliefs with the people that we live next to. We might not even share interests. We might really dislike them, a lot. We might have to avoid them, all this sort of stuff. All of a sudden we are juxtaposed with people with whom we feel very unfamiliar and perhaps unsafe. And that is just such a radical change from the situation that we were in 10,000 years ago, even 2,000 years ago. And paralleling this change has been a rise in individualism, which is new. Individualism is, there's actually scholarship that calls it weird. And all of the letters, it's an acronym for something, and I won't be able to tell you precisely what they are right now. But I is the individualism, is the I in the weird. And then there are other phenomena categories that exist alongside it. Now, where does this individualism come from? Because there are other countries in the world that have modernized, but they haven't become as hyper individualistic as we have here in the States and other countries that identify as the quote unquote West. Why are we so individualistic? Actually, some theorists think it's because of Christianity, which is very interesting, the rapid growth of Christianity a couple thousand years ago. Prior to the growth of Christianity, people identified with their families and their city-states, which is very interesting. That's where your loyalty was. That's where your purpose was. And after the events around Christ, and especially the theorizations of Paul, Apostle Paul, there existed this idea that it was the individual, it was your innerness, it was what you believed in your own heart that was your salvation. It was no longer you going off to war for your particular clan. It was no longer you practicing the role that was allocated to you in your city-state. All of a sudden, your personal subjective relationship, your belief, your interaction with the ideas, your relationship, your personal relationship with Jesus Christ was really important. And this wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the reasons why Christianity was so catching. Another was because it was this individualism liberated, in a sense. It began the liberation of so many people, because in this very hierarchical culture before then, there was the patricians and the plebeians, right? There was, and that was a division in ancient Rome. The patricians were the citizen class, and they were allowed to vote, and they had so many rights. And we often talk about those ancient times, we romanticize them, but there was a very small group of leaders, the firstborn males of households, that, and then eventually other males were allowed in, but they were the ones that had rights, and women didn't. Men lower on the hierarchy in a family didn't. There were slaves, quite a few slaves in that culture. And all of a sudden, when Christianity rolled around and Paul really worked out this theology, there came this idea that individuals were worthwhile and all were equal in front of God and had equal standing and right, in a sense. And of course, this was a very imperfect delivery of the message, but it did plant seeds of individualistic thinking. And now this was woven in various ways throughout the next several hundred years. But individual rights were important. And we also saw in the Middle Ages the rise of commerce, and people on a very individualized basis began to move to cities, began to practice their trades, began to trade between different feudal systems, between different lords, between different knights. And this sort of got the wheels of capitalism going. And there had also been, finally, this injunction, which I talk about with Amod Lele. I think it's episode 28 of this podcast, not sure. Look for Amod Lele. We talk about individualism. We talk about the origins of the injunction to be yourself. Now, that actually does stem from the Greeks. It's before Paul in Christian theology, but there was this idea that you should strive to be yourself, and that was woven, carried throughout different threads in society and in philosophy, and began blossoming, a few hundred years ago, and really began taking off as people began to question the authority of the church. There was an irony, in a sense, in that the church, or the theology rather, related to Christianity, gave people this idea of their individual worth, and then eventually it manifested as a questioning of the church's authority and the multiplying of different religious worldviews, and then the development of science as people began really questioning things and looking to base their beliefs on their own reason. And this all just sort of snowballed together. Injunctions to be yourself, to think for yourself, to earn money for yourself and your family, all became deeply intertwined. And now we live in a world, right, where we are so on our own and we have to choose our own beliefs. And of course, you're born into them, but you still know that so many others exist around you, and you have the freedom to choose a different one if you want. And some people might try to convince you, and you need to decide who you are amidst the sea of diversity. And this is problems for loneliness. We definitely feel less connected. We feel more isolated. We feel more like islands, all of us. And this is a huge contrast to other parts in the world in which people are still deeply embedded in their families, deeply embedded in shared meaning and shared narrative, and not encouraged to break out of it, and of course there were problems to that as well. But this just highlights the difference, and the problem of loneliness in the West. And this isn't to say that there isn't loneliness in cultures that are more collectivistic, because there certainly are. And especially as they are picking up on the ideas of being yourself and finding your new communities that are sort of coming out of this individualistic culture in the West. Previously in the last episode with Dr. Ellie Pierce, we talked about how nowadays we have communities based on shared interest. We construct our own communities. And that's another thing. We're constructing our own this, constructing our own that. Everything we have to do, we have to build for ourselves. And that's just kind of a fact of this world. And there's no way around it. But it's, I think, important to know it. And it can help us in our quest to connect with people, because it provides a way to understand our own emotions, to understand why we might feel lonely, to understand why we might feel anxious about making connections, to understand why we might feel so isolated all the time. And if we can understand these things, then we can perhaps move forward remediating them. We can begin to plant roots in local communities. We can do our best to unite our shared threads, our different stories, our different narratives. We can do our best to share in these things with people, and to have a purpose that feels related to the broader whole, not just to ourselves, but to everybody. And that can be really helpful as a defense against loneliness. There's a lot more that I could say on this topic, obviously. I basically just talked about the last 10,000 years of individualism and loneliness in this culture particularly. But it was a broad overview, but I think important. And I just sort of wanted to elevate the historical threads that have led to such a unique moment of isolation here in the modern West. And that's what I did. This has been episode number 32X. To reiterate, I have not been, because of iTunes policies, I've said this in a previous episode, but I mentioned it again, because of policies on podcasting platforms, I'm no longer publicizing the numbers of these podcasts in the same way I was before, but it is still number 32X, and I will provide links, specific and high quality links in the show notes to any kinds of episodes that I reference, so you can find them easily. As for example, Dr. Amod Lele, episode number 28, he's a few down from this one. So thank you so much for tuning in. It has been an honor and a privilege as ever to share these ideas with you here on the Naked Humanity podcast. I am Stefani Ruper. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Stefani Ruper. Please do get at me. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will talk to you next week.